Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Sunday night video. This week I am covering the story of the mysterious death of Charles Docherty, the arrest of his brother John for the murder, and the strange outcome of the inquest, all of which took place in Wallsend in 1876. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. Those involved in this week's story are brothers, so it will be easier to do their backstory together, as most of the information will be the same. And some of the information is actually unavailable, so the information will also be quite basic. And this was due to the fact that there was lots of different spellings of the family surname when I was doing the search. John Docherty was the brother of Charles and James. Charles was the oldest, then John, and then the youngest was James. And the brothers also had a sister by the name of Anne. Their parents were Anne and James, both of whom had been born in Ireland, and the family lived in Wallsend in Heppel's Cottages. Heppel's Cottages were a row of around 6 cottages behind part of the High Street West. John was described as a general labourer and Charles was a cooper, someone who made wooden barrels. It seems that apart from James, the brothers were known to drink quite a lot. Charles was said to be around 26 years old at the time of his death, and just to add on to the end, it is possible that all of Anne and James's children had been born in Gateshead. On Saturday, December the 2nd, Charles Docherty returned to his home in Wallsend after a day out drinking. After his supper, he had gone to sit beside the fire. And after only a few moments, he fell off his chair, and his mother Anne, who had been in bed at the time, heard the strange sound and got up to see what was going on, and she found Charles lying on the floor. Anne then called for her other son, James, to come and help her lift Charles into bed. James noticed blood on the floor, and when he looked at Charles he saw a very bad wound to his head, telling his mother that he did not think Charles was going to survive this wound. After placing Charles in bed, James went to look for a doctor. While he was out looking for a doctor, he met P.C. McCallum, who asked him what he was doing, and he said he was looking for a doctor, telling him that his brother had been hurt and that his other brother John had attacked him. Dr. Murray treated Charles for the wound to his head, and he remained in bed until his death on the following Monday morning. He was never able to tell anyone what had happened to him. P.C. McCallum, on hearing of the death of Charles and acting on the information he had received earlier, arrested John Docherty for the murder of his brother Charles. The inquest was held at the Anchor Hotel in Wallsend before Coroner Green. Anne Docherty said she had identified the body as being that of her son Charles, who was 26 years old and worked as a cooper. She said Charles lived with her in Wallsend, and that on the night in question she believed he had returned home just before midnight. She said he had been very drunk when he came home and had sat on a chair by the fire. She did not know how long he had sat there, as she had gone to bed, but she did hear him fall off the chair and got up to see what had happened. She said she found Charles on the floor by the fireplace. She said she tried to pick him up but was not able to, so she called for her son James to help. And James, she said, was upstairs in bed at the time. When James picked Charles up, Anne said he told her, "He's done for, his head is fractured." She said she didn't notice any blood on the floor or on Charles when he had first come in. She then said that apart from sending James for a doctor, she could not remember any more about that night. The jury were then able to question Anne, and they asked her a series of questions, asking her what time James had come home, and she said around 11 p.m. They asked her if he had been drunk, and she said James did not drink. They then said, did James and Charles argue, and she said they did not, and she said she did not argue with her sons either. Strangely, they did not seem to ask her if Charles and John had argued, even though he was the brother accused of the crime and not James. They asked her many questions that seemed to be very similar to the ones they had asked her previously, and Anne began to get quite upset. And finally, after asking her what side Charles was lying on the floor when she found him, and Anne having been unable to answer for certain, she then cried out, "I've lost my son, nobody harmed him, I can tell you no more, take me home." At this point it seemed that Anne was about to faint, and it was decided not to ask her any further questions and to allow her to leave the room. James Docherty said he lived with his mother and brothers at Wallsend and worked as a labourer at the shipyards. He said on the night in question he had been in bed when his mother called him to come and help his brother Charles. He said there was a lamp burning in the room and he could see his brother on the floor by the fire. He said he noticed a lot of blood on the floor. He was able to sit his brother up at first, and on seeing the wound to his head, he said he had told his mother he will never rise again. He said his brother John came home while he was trying to move Charles, and he said that John helped him to take Charles to bed. He said John had been drinking, but he did not think that he was drunk. The foreman of the jury then questioned James, asking him what time he had come home that night, and James said it was around 10 p.m, and that Charles had come home around 11 p.m. The foreman asked if they were on good terms, and he said they were, saying that they had had supper together that night when Charles had first come home. The foreman then stated that Anne had said Charles came home at midnight, but he had said he came home at 11, and also that he, James, had come home at 11 p.m, but he had just told the jury that he came home at 10 p.m. James said his mother had been in bed for 3 days and was very confused. He was then asked what side Charles had been lying on the floor, and James, after at first saying he was not sure, said he thought he had been lying on his right-hand side. He was then asked if he had gone for the doctor, and he said that he had gone to find Dr. Aitchison, but when he was not able to find him, he had gone to look for Dr. Murray. He said it was when he was looking for Dr. Murray that he had met P.C. McCallum in Wallsend. He said that he had asked him where he was going, and he had told him he was going to look for a doctor as his brother was ill. Finally, he was asked if John had been at home when Charles came in, which was a strange question to ask, seeing as obviously James had already said that he hadn't been. He said he had not been in the house since dinner time. He was not asked what John had done after Charles had been put to bed. Elijah Mormon of the Queen's Head, Wallsend, said Charles had been in his pub several times on the day of his death, firstly around 3 p.m. when he stayed for an hour, then he had returned around 6 p.m. and had stayed until around 11 p.m. He said he did not have much to drink, and he felt that he was not drunk when he left his pub. He did not see him leave, and he did not know if he left alone or with someone else. I must add here that the landlord is probably being a little economical with the truth. If Charles had been drinking all day, it is unlikely that he would have been very sober. So it is possible that Elijah is trying to cover up the fact that he may have been serving a man with drinks when he was already drunk. P.C. McCallum said he had met James Docherty in Wallsend at around 12:30 a.m. on the morning of December the 3rd, and he said he seemed to be wandering on the high street. He said James spoke to him first, saying he was going for a doctor, and P.C. McCallum said he had asked him what was wrong, and James had told him his brother was unwell. He said he had then asked him what was wrong with him, and James had replied saying, "My 2 brothers were arguing, and one struck the other on the head with a large stick and cut his head open." He continued by saying that James had said it was John who had hit Charles. At this point, James was asked about this, and he denied that he had ever said anything to the policeman about his brothers fighting. He said he had only told him he was going for a doctor as his brother was ill, and nothing more. There was no evidence given at the inquest by Dr. Murray. However, Dr. Aitchison said he had performed the post-mortem on the body of Charles Docherty. He said Charles had a severe wound to the left side of his head, which had caused a fracture to the skull, and he said that his death had been caused by this fracture to the skull and the blood clots that had formed within the brain. One of the jury then asked Dr. Aitchison if it was possible that this injury could have been caused by a fall, and he said he did not think so. He was then asked again that if Charles had stood up and fallen, would this have made a difference, and again Dr. Aitchison said he did not believe so. However, he did add that if he had fallen and hit his head on the fender, then it was possible. The coroner then spoke to the jury, stating that the fracture was on the left side of Charles's head, and that although his mother would not commit herself to which side he was lying on when he had fallen, his brother had said he had fallen on his right side, and this could be a mistake, or it could be the truth. He said it was for them to decide if this injury was due to a fall or due to a fight between Charles and his brother John. The jury retired for quite some time before returning with the verdict that Charles Docherty had died due to a fracture to the skull caused by violence, but that there was no evidence to show who had been responsible for this violence. John at this point was still not free to go, as it was stated that he would be brought before the magistrates at the next Tynemouth Petty Sessions. And this session took place just a few days later. John at the time was still on a charge of causing the death of his brother. The same evidence was given at this hearing as had been given at the inquest, and the magistrates said based on this evidence they could not send John for trial. They would, however, order him to be bound over with a surety of £20, and after this John was free to leave. And I did not find any further details of John or of after this date. I did not find any details of a funeral for Charles Docherty. As is often the case, this may have been a pauper's funeral. At the time, the Wallsend cemetery, better known now as Churchbank Cemetery, was not yet open, so it is most likely that Charles would have been buried in the churchyard of St. Peter's Church in Wallsend. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Charles anywhere in the area. This was an absolutely baffling case. Throughout the inquest, no evidence was given of a fight between Charles and John, and no one seemed to have seen the two men argue at any time. And John did not seem to make any statement to the police, and the police have never gave any details of anything he said when he was arrested. The landlord of the Queen's Head said Charles was not drunk when he left, but his mother had said he was very drunk when he came home. Who was telling the truth on this one is hard to say. As said earlier, the landlord may have been lying to protect his licence, but then again, so could Charles's mother. The only suggestion that John had attacked Charles seemed to have come from James when he had spoken to the policeman when he was looking for the doctor. However, he later denied ever saying this, saying that he had been at home with Charles at 11 p.m. having supper, and he did not say that Charles was injured at this time, and he did not say that Charles had gone back out again after this, thus suggesting that his injuries could only have been caused in the house when he had fallen, and not caused by John. But was this the truth? Well, reading between the lines, it feels that it is possible that John did attack Charles, and that Charles had told James about it when he came home. And between James and his mother, they decided to cover this up, with Anne suggesting Charles was very drunk, thus giving a reason for him to fall. And James, when looking for the doctor, may have panicked and told the policeman the truth, but then later denied it, as with no witnesses having seen the fight, there was no proof that it had ever happened. It seems possible that Anne, having already lost one son, had no desire to lose another. And this left the jury with no option but to find an open verdict, as they had no real evidence that John was ever involved. And while I am not sure that this is entirely true, I believe based on the details they had, they did come to the correct verdict. And at the later hearing, it does seem that the magistrates did not entirely believe John was innocent, but without enough evidence they could not send him to trial. But what do you think? Do you think John did attack Charles before he came home? Do you think Anne and James covered this up so that Anne would not lose two of her sons? Or do you think it was possible that Charles had fallen and hit his head on the fender and caused his own injuries, even though James did seem to admit that Charles was lying on the ground on his right side when the wound was on the left? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very strange, sad and mysterious story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.